Hi all, welcome to part two of my Intro to Greek Myth slides, or lecture, I suppose. So we left off, we were talking about the classical period. This is the period of Athenian drama. It's also the period of Alexander. I was talking about him. So he conquered a lot of the known world at the time, the near East, and well, the known world for the Greeks, anyways. So he conquered a big swath of land, and his death, his sudden death, and there's some debate about what caused his death, but his sudden death marks the end of this classical period. So I thought some maps would be useful at this point. So here's the pre-Alexander world of ancient Greece. You can see most of the important cities are clustered around these islands, right? Crete is down here, and then there are some other important islands, right? There's even some islands over here, uh, getting into the Persian Empire, right? And some of the myths you'll hear, they'll talk about the land of Thrace, they'll talk about Macedon, right? Byzantium. They'll talk about these different places, and these are like far-flung places for the Greek world, right? So if they talk about Thrace, that's like this far-away land. Remember, this is, there's no cars or trains or whatnot. So if you had to get from, say, Athens to Delos, the island of Delos, that would be a kind of perilous sea journey depending on the time of the year. Okay, so this is ancient Greece pre-Alexander, right? And here's Athens, one of the key cities, perhaps the key city when we get into the drama section. And here is Alexander's empire. This is the land he took over, right? So this is what we were just looking at. That would be a close-up of that area. But you can see he took over this giant swath of land, right? Many times the area of the original, Macedonia is this area up here. Greece is more down here, right? But he took over, whoa, all of this area, even went into India, right? This is a giant empire. Upon his death, it was split up amongst his generals, right? You have the different kingdoms were taken over by his different underlings, I guess you could call it, and eventually things fell apart. So this was the beginning of the end for the Greek Empire in a way. But after Alexander's death, it's not like the Greeks totally fell apart. This is what we call the Hellenistic period. This is actually the greatest spread of Greek culture because if we go back to this map, all these different kingdoms were ruled by the Greek cultural forces for hundreds of years and built all kinds of great libraries, right? The Library of Alexandria, and just different cultural sites which used the Greek myth and religion as its backbone. So the spread of Greek culture is really widespread during this period, especially. It's also the most imperialistic period, right? Greek language and culture spread. Everybody's speaking Greek. This is what we call the lingua franca, the common language of the area. Much as English has become the lingua franca for most of the world, right? At this time, it was Greek, and later on, it becomes Latin. So colonists built temples and theaters in the Greek style. You can still find Greek temples and theaters all over this area. The polises, the city-states became less independent, more tied to a kind of central monarchy. Athens is still its cultural center, but it's definitely downgraded. Okay, this takes us into Rome, right? The period of the Hellenistic period. We end this period after the Battle of Actium when the Roman forces beat the Greek and took over the area, right? And then we have the Republican Rome and then the Imperial Rome when Octavian takes over. But we won't go into that too much. We're not getting into Roman history, just an interesting end cap to the ancient Greek world. But, one thing to keep in mind is like Greek culture doesn't die just because the Romans take over. Greek culture is very much the backbone of a lot of Roman culture, especially their myths. If we got into that, I think I have some memes on my syllabus about this, about, Roman mythology basically just being a copy of Greek mythology. And we'll talk about this, but some of the names for the gods you might be more familiar with the Roman versions, right? Mars, their god of war is just Ares, just with another name. Venus is Aphrodite, etc., right? All the planets are named after the Roman version of the same gods, or almost all of them. There's one that's not. Anyways, this takes us into sources for Greek myths. The five we're going to really concentrate on, and I want you to know are Homer, Hesiod, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. So these last three are classical playwrights. These two are writing in the classical period, or the archaic period, I should say. We're going to read other texts, what are called Homeric hymns. They weren't actually written by Homer. They're just called Homeric hymns because they're kind of written in his style, but there's very little evidence to suggest that he actually wrote any of them. There's a basic, they are written by anonymous sources. We're going to read some of them, but they are, and even though they're called Homeric hymns, don't be fooled, they're not written by Homer. So these are 5 big names you should know. There are tons of other sources of myths. Pindar is important. He wrote a lot of odes and poetry during the time. Apollonius of Rhodes collected myths. Virgil and Ovid are writing later in the Roman period, and so is Plutarch. So these are Roman writers, but they're very much sources of the ancient mythology. But anyways, we won't be getting into too much. We won't get into any of this, but there are tons of other names. I want you to keep that in mind. But these are the 5 we're going to think about this semester. Okay, now let's look at some important terms to think about Greek life and society: polytheism versus monotheism, anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. So, these are big words. Polytheism is just the belief in multiple gods. So the Greeks believed in multiple gods. There wasn't one god that they believed in. Zeus was kind of the leader of the gods, but he split up the realm, if you will. And his 2 brothers, Poseidon and Hades, were the other big figures that controlled major swaths of the known universe, right? Poseidon got the realm of the sea, Hades got the underworld. So the Greeks believed in multiple gods. There wasn't one god, even though Zeus was the most powerful. He still was more of like a CEO of the gods rather than the godhead, right? And monotheism just means a belief in one god, like the Judeo-Christian faith, right? There's one God, it's God, right? There's the Godhead for Christians, especially, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and God himself or itself, whichever pronoun you want to use. But there's that one God figure that they worship. The Greeks were not like that. Even though Zeus was the most powerful, you could spend your whole life being a devotee of Athena and never worship Zeus and still be part of the same religious system. Anthropomorphism just means when we give human characteristics to non-human things. So Mickey Mouse is an anthropomorphic figure of a mouse, right? And this is important to think about because the gods in the Greek pantheon are very human in a way that the Judeo-Christian God just is not, right? We do anthropomorphize the Judeo-Christian God, right? We call him the Father, and things like that, and we use the pronoun he to describe the Christian God, Judeo-Christian God. But a God can't actually be a he, right? Because that would be limiting that figure's power in a way and making it human, which God is not human, right? So we do that a little bit with Judeo-Christian God, but the Greeks take it to a whole other level, right? I mean, as we're going to see, and you're probably already familiar with, Zeus, can't keep it in his pants, right? He's a figure of lust and unbridled instinct and desire at times, right? In a very human way. And this is a source of comedy at times, not only very serious stuff, but he's kind of a funny figure at times because he's constantly getting in trouble with Hera because he can't stop himself from, he could stop himself, but he chooses not to stop himself from running around after women. And, it gets, I'm being light about this, but it gets super icky because it gets into the realm of sexual assault and stuff too. But my point is, the gods of the Greeks are much more human than what we're used to think about with gods. The last term, anthropocentrism, just means humans are centered in these stories. Even though we're going to be reading about the origin stories of the gods, it's always about humans. The gods are very human, and it's all about, it all leads up to the era of man, or humankind, I should say, right? There would be no significance of these gods if there were no humans, right? So even though we're reading a lot about the gods, remember that in a very fundamental way for the Greeks, their religion is anthropocentric, right? Humans are at the center of this, much like Judeo-Christianity, right? Humans are very much the center of the story, right? It's all about our moral choices that we make and how that pleases God and such. Same for the Greeks, right? Humans are the center of the story, even though it's all about gods and mythical beings and these demigod heroes. It's all about the human story, right? And if you want to break some of these words down, anthro just means humankind, right? Specifically mankind, but we can be less sexist. Centrism, it just means centered, right? Morphism taking the form of theism is, a religion, mono, one, poly is more than one, so more than one God, human taking the form of a human, human centered, right? So fancy words, but they just mean some relatively easy to understand things. Let's get into some other stuff. This is what I was talking about, anthropocentrism, right? The gods are basically one big family. One other point I wanted to make. They're very much related, and they have squabbles, and they fight, but they come back together in a very human way. Okay. For Greeks, honor and individualism and competitiveness are cardinal values. These are super important ways that we're not used to thinking about. We think about this a bit, and I was thinking about this the other day with, especially in a lot of music. I was listening to I don't know, some hip hop or rap song while I was working out, and there's a lot of like boasting in those songs, and it reminded me a lot of this kind of warrior culture stuff, like the ancient Greek culture. Greeks, if you weren't singing your own praises, then you weren't a good hero. I think nowadays we tend to take humility as more of a value, right? You shouldn't brag about yourself. The Greeks didn't think like that, right? If you were the best, you should tell everybody you're the best, right? Tragedies focus on the rise and fall of a single figure, right? So it's all about the individual honoring glory. It's not so much about social issues as much as that individual standing in for more social issues. What else? On the other side of this, right, there was a very fatalistic culture. The Greeks had no real afterlife as we would know it, or conception of the afterlife. There was no heaven for most Greeks when they died. Some of the best heroes were taken to the Elysium fields, but that's about it. You'd have to be like an Achilles to get there, basically. Even then, Achilles, as we're going to see in the Odyssey, doesn't get there. This is a later Greek belief about the afterlife. Most Greek belief, especially earlier stuff, doesn't have a very rosy conception of the afterlife, or even a very developed conception of the afterlife. Hades, there's almost no myths about Hades, and there's very little written about the afterlife. Also, there's this idea of hubris. So as much as the last slide I was showing you is a very braggy culture, individualism and competitiveness and singing your own praise is important. Unfettered pride is called hubris. Excessive pride, aggressive arrogance, that kind of thing is called hubris. So again, think about Icarus, which I was talking about earlier. He is guilty of hubris. He thought he could do whatever he wanted. He thought he didn't have to listen to his father Daedalus, who warned him not to fly too close to the sun. He thought, hey, I'm powerful. I can do this, and I can do whatever I want. And he flew too close to the sun, and he died for his mistake, right? So that's called hubris, and it's a very key point to understanding a lot of the Greek stories, especially as we get into the plays. All right, a couple things about the function of myth quickly. So myth was important for Greek culture. There's different interpretations of this. A couple things about the religious life of the Greeks. It was basically built around cults, which are this has a bad sense for us, this word, but what it meant is just like groups of people worshiping individual gods. So you'd have a cult devoted to Dionysus or a cult devoted to Athena, right? And there was no central text. They had no one Bible where everybody would study from that one text and it told about all the different gods. Instead, different cults would have their own, leaders and tell their own stories, right? And it would all function together, but you would have different allegiances depending on where you lived, what social status you were, maybe even your employment, right? If you were an ironsmith, you might worship Hephaestus, right? If you were in different spheres, you would, be parts of different cults. Rituals were part of domestic life, right? There were rituals all the time, feast days, this kind of stuff. Sacrifice is part of this, right? But we don't know how much Greeks believed in this on a day-to-day level, right? We have very few written records. And in fact, the philosophers, Plato and Socrates and these, they really call into doubt a lot of the belief in these myths. These myths are seen as just old stories for them by that point in Greek history. So there's a bit here about festivals and civic identity, but that's about it for now. You can look over these slides yourself.